How many of you think that it's unfair? Okay, I think that's unanimous. Who would like to comment on this? Someone volunteer.
Well, it says that they came to conquer land that somebody already was occupied, so I couldn't imagine that. I wouldn't think that it would be fair for it to be theirs, because they're coming to take it over.
Okay.
Sounds like they're coming to steal it.
Yes, it's pretty unanimous in this audience. What do you think the Supreme Court had to say at this early time in our history?
Strong survive.
So you can mark an F on the right side because they did indeed decide that it was fair. Of course, the opinion has been criticized by this audience and by many others. Yes.
I think
further comments.
It's interesting that it's sort of like if we move in and we create laws and we superimpose ourselves and our government and our laws on the people literally underneath us as we're stomping on them, that it's sort of like, well, we have our laws, so we have, in other words, it couldn't apply. It couldn't apply. In other words, they probably were not considered a part of the people who were governed at that point.
Or they weren't people.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. Could you imagine if we did that nowadays? Like going to your neighbor's house, I'm conquering your house, so therefore it's mine now.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Cynthia mentioned, what the court argued, obviously, and so it came down that the ruling came down that it was fair. Okay, to much criticism, of course, but that's how the court ruling did come down. Any further discussion? Yes, Deb.
Was this ever officially overturned at any point?
No, but of course there have been a series of efforts, to do everything from establish, Indian gaming and make special help for economic help for people, and but there are some decisions that, although it's very unlikely that it would ever be held again, and certain steps were taken to mitigate, were never officially overturned. Okay? Okay. So our next case then is the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford of 1857. Here, a slave claimed to be free after being moved into a state free from slavery, but was told that he was still a slave and that as an African American he could never be a citizen. How many of you think this is fair? Okay. How many of you think that it's unfair? Okay. And so this is unanimous. Who would like to comment on this? No one? Okay. Well, it's pretty self-obvious to us that it's unfair. What do you think the Supreme Court had to say at this early stage in our history, pre-Civil War? Yeah. Okay. Dred Scott has been viewed as perhaps the single worst decision of the Supreme Court, but it did indeed decide that it was fair, and therefore Dred Scott was not a citizen, he was a slave, and Dred Scott lost to extreme criticism, but that's how the ruling did come down. Any further discussion?
One thing I'd like to ask you, Steve, is in 1823 and in 1857, was there any measure of how the public themselves felt? Not the Supreme Court, but just how John Q. public in the U.S. felt about those two decisions. Obviously, from our perspective here in 2010, we're all saying it was unfair. But what did the people back then think? Was there any measure of that?
Well, obviously, there was no Gallup organization back then. But, I would suppose it would vary from individual to individual. I mean, there were good people who were abolitionists, for example, who realized what a terrible mistake was made, and there were a lot of people who actually kept slaves, who thought it was part of our culture and that it was, reasonable. Obviously, none of us feel that way today, and we realize what a terrible mistake was made, but I think it would vary from individual to individual. Okay? Now, At this time, before we go any further with discussion about Supreme Court cases, there are some very important historic events that occurred. Between the years 1861 and 1865, the Union, or North, fought against the Confederacy, or South, in the American Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln led the country during this war. The Union, or North, or anti-slavery states defeated the Southern Confederacy pro-slavery states. The Southern states actually threatened to secede from the Union, but the Union was preserved because the North won. President Lincoln freed the slaves originally through a document called the Emancipation Proclamation, and then was assassinated almost immediately after the war. However, he did not live to see these 3 constitutional amendments added, but within 5 years of the war, 3 very important constitutional amendments were added, and even though he did not live to see these amendments added, his work was instrumental in getting these amendments adopted to the Constitution. So let's take a look at these very important post-Civil War constitutional amendments. First, we have the 13th Amendment, which came in the same year the war ended, 1865. It was added to our Constitution to abolish slavery throughout the United States. Then, 3 years later, in 1868, the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Now, the 14th Amendment did several things, one of which was grant citizenship to all people born in the United States. So before we discuss the other provisions of the 14th Amendment, notice that between the 13th Amendment's prohibition on slavery and the 14th Amendment's grant of citizenship to all people born in the United States, the Dred Scott decision was effectively overruled by constitutional amendment. Remember, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That includes any constitutional amendments once they are added to the Constitution. So, as bad as the decision was, the Supreme Court never really had occasion to specifically overrule Dred Scott. But since the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, including the constitutional amendments, Dred Scott can no longer be cited as good law. Okay? Now, the 14th Amendment also, for the first time, added equal protection to the Constitution, very specifically. So, we criticized the first 2 decisions and would have hoped that the court would have done the right thing just for the sake of doing the right thing. One thing that the court was doing was interpreting the Constitution as it was written, which actually made provision for slavery, did not include equal protection. So now, from here on forward, now there's an equal protection clause specifically in the Constitution. So from now on, when we continue to discuss the cases, the court will have to keep in mind that equal protection is now a requirement that they're required to enforce. Okay? So that's most significant to what we're discussing here, the addition of equal protection to the Constitution. And then we have the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote. In fact, prohibited voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So, a very important voting rights provision. As an aside, it wasn't until 50 years later that women gained the right to vote. In 1920, at least nationally, under the Constitution by the 19th Amendment. So sometimes rights take a long time to take effect.